North America was primarily shaped by the Great Ice Age, which caused the shifting of terrain and formation of rivers and valleys. This ice age caused the sea level to drop, exposing a land bridge that allowed Native Americans to cross Eurasia to North America. Sophisticated civilizations with advanced agricultural practices, elaborate-built cities, and far-flung commerce were shaped by the Incas in Peru, Mayans in Central America, and Aztecs in Mexico. The cultivation of maize, beans, and squash made possible three-sister farming, which transformed nomadic hunter-gatherers to agriculture-based villages and ultimately contributed to a high population. In 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the New World in search of a new route to India. When the Old World collided with the New World, many crops, precious metals, and deadly diseases were exchanged. In the 1500s, Spanish conquistadors, or conquerors, began expanding and overthrowing different regions. These conquistadors include Ferdinand Magellan, the first to circumnavigate the globe, Hernan Cortez, who overtook Mexico, and Francisco Pizarro, who crushed the Incas in Peru. In the late 1600s, spiritual uprisings and concepts were introduced in Spanish America, such as Pope's Rebellion in 1680, caused by the efforts of Roman Catholic missionaries to suppress native religious customs, in the false concept of Black Legend, which held that the conquerors had made life miserable for the Indians in the name of God. In the early 1500s, England was much more interested in religious affairs than the establishment of overseas colonies. However, Queen Elizabeth I encouraged English buccaneers to colonize North America and promote Protestantism. Ships of the Spanish Armada invaded England in 1588, but the English fought back, resulting in victory. In the late 1500s, England was overwhelmed with an excessive population gain, and colonization was attempted once again. In 1606, settlers sailed for Jamestown near Chesapeake Bay, where they established a colony that would undergo much malnutrition, starvation, and epidemic. Tensions between the settlers and Native Americans led to two Anglo-Powhatan wars in the 1600s, in which the Indians attempted to rid their territory of Virginians, but were defeated both times. The Native Americans suffered from Old World diseases that wiped out entire populations, and they began to lose their place in the expanding Atlantic economy. England's southernmost mainland colonies were similar in that they all contained some forms of slaves and were each devoted to exporting agricultural products. Virginia became the birthplace of representative self-government and slavery to aid in the cultivation of tobacco. Maryland served as a safe haven for Catholics to practice their religion freely, and the Carolinas were unique for their close ties with the West Indies, whose economy was based mainly on sugar production and the cultivation of rice as their main export crop. And lastly, Georgia was perhaps the least prosperous in that it was slow-growing and the least populous of all the colonies. Calvinism, the basis for Puritanism, was introduced by John Calvin and focused on predestination, the belief that people were appointed by God to be saved or burn in hell. Calvinism began to take shape in England after Henry VIII broke his ties with the Roman Catholic Church, but Puritans were not satisfied with the slow progress of the English Protestant Reformation. A group of radical Puritans, called Separatists, decided to break away and settle in New England. Departing via Mayflower, the Pilgrims landed near Plymouth Bay. In 1629, Charles I authorized persecution of Puritans, resulting in moderate Puritans obtaining a royal charter and leaving New England to form the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The church had a major influence in the colony, in which certain rights were only given to church members, and ministry was the most respected profession. However, the Bay Colony was not in complete harmony. A group of Quakers were persecuted, and some people, such as Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams, were banished from the colony. Rhode Island, otherwise known as the Sewer, was established by Roger Williams and allowed freedom of religion. New England began to spread out, in which Connecticut was founded by Reverend Thomas Hooker, and New Haven, a Connecticut settlement, sprang up in the 1630s. In 1637, confrontations involving Indian tribes such as the Pequot and the settlers exploded after the Connecticut River Colony pushed the Indians further back. In 1643, 4 colonies combined together to form the New England Confederation, the first step to colonial unity. In 1686, the Dominion of New England was formed by royal authority designed to take the Confederation. Led by Sir Edmund Andros, the Dominion allowed taxation without representation and revoked land titles. In the 17th century, naval wars were continuously fought between the English and the Dutch purchased Manhattan Island and created New Amsterdam, present-day New York. In the mid-1600s, Quakers, a people of deep conviction, denied support for the Church of England by taxes, spoke up regularly in town meetings, and managed to secure a charter in Pennsylvania in 1681 under William Penn. Pennsylvania was liberal with freedom of religion, no immigration restrictions, capital punishment given only to those convicted of treason and murder, and no provision for an army. Life for the earliest Chesapeake settlers was miserable, with fragile families and constant death, caused mainly by deadly diseases. The extensive tobacco cultivation led to the use of indentured servants due to labor shortage. Freed men who had previously worked as indentured servants most often lived in poverty, which led to Bacon's Rebellion. This revolt was led by Nathaniel Bacon and was intended to be the end of impoverished freemen unable to acquire their own land. Landowners began to see indentured servants as dangerous from there on and looked to Africa for labor. 10 million slaves were carried in the Middle Passage after the Royal African Company lost its monopoly and the price on slaves dropped. Most slaves came from the west coast of Africa and worked long hours on tobacco plantations. In Southern society, a hierarchy of wealth was formed and a dominant house of burgesses was held. There were also not very many cities, good roads, or waterways for transportation. In the New England colonies, however, there were few diseases, clean water, stable families, population incline, property rights for women, and a longer average lifespan. New England towns were tightly knit with Puritan church and democracy and some elementary education. Most colonists had small farms, and the geography allowed a diverse variety of crops to farm. Worries plagued the minds of Puritan settlers, and the Halfway Covenant was established in 1662 to expand church membership. Religious paranoia led to the Salem witch trials, in which 20 individuals were persecuted for being accused of witchcraft. In the 18th century, an excessive population gain occurred mainly because of the natural fertility of Americans. Colonial America was a huge melting pot of different races, including Germans, Irish, Scottish, Dutch, and Swiss, resulting in the most diverse population in the world at that time. In colonial society, most colonists were small farmers. There was no titled nobility, and cities contained skilled artisans, shopkeepers, and tradesmen. Christian ministry was the most honored profession. Agriculture was the leading industry, involving about 90% of the population. Infamously profitable, the triangular trade exported raw materials, manufactured goods, and slaves between Europe, America, and Africa. Trade with other European countries gradually slowed England's economy. Roads in the 1700s were treacherously deficient, thus making waterways a much better way to travel. Two established churches in 1775 was the Church of England and the Congregational Church. By this time, religious toleration had made many strides in America, and individuals were permitted to worship as they desired. The first mass movement of peoples took place in the religious revival known as the Great Awakening. Preacher Jonathan Edwards, as well as many other religious leaders and speakers, reached many people, igniting an emphasis on spirituality. Education in the colonies was mainly for boys, with focus on Latin, Greek, and religion. Puritans were extremely interested in education, and 9 colleges were established. Art in the colonies was not particularly appreciated, and many ambitious artists were forced to travel to London to pursue their careers. The colony's government consisted of royal governors, direct representation, and a bicameral legislative branch. Similar to that of Britain, the French entered into the American colonial scramble late, developing a large empire off of profits from the fur trade. Throughout the course of much of the 17th and 18th centuries, France and Britain were caught in the middle of a power struggle that resulted in many world wars. In America, these wars caused the commissioning of a widespread military duel for the imperial control of the continent. George Washington's endeavor to kill the French leader succeeded, but it soon erupted into war with France. Under William Pitt, the British saw victory at Quebec, forcing the French out of North America in the 7 Years' War, otherwise known as the French and Indian War. Colonists in America had played a large role in the British wars with France and became confident of their abilities. Tensions between the colonists and Britain arose, however, when French and Spanish threat to Britain was removed. An uprising in 1763 by the Ottawas persuaded the British to continue stationing troops in American colonies. But the colonists were not willing to pay taxes for British protection with threats from France and Spain gone, and they began to resent British authority over them. The American Revolution was a much deeper transformation of thought and loyalty than the American War of Independence. The American Revolution began when the colonies separated politically from Britain. The previously enjoyed American wilderness that provided self-government and considerable freedom brought about tension among the colonists who participated in the British mercantile system. British mercantilism had some economic benefits as well as limiting freedoms of the colonists, aiding in an increase of resentment towards the British government. The British imposed higher taxes and tighter imperial rule over the colonists, seeming reasonable to the British but offensive to the fundamental rights of the colonists. Through many boycotts, the colonists forced the repeal of the Stamp Act of 1765 as well as all the Townshend Acts, except for the tea tax. Patriots, frustrated with the government's attempt to enforce the tea tax, rebelled with the Boston Tea Party. The British retaliated with harsh, intolerable acts and the Quebec Act, infuriating American colonists to the clash of arms at Lexington and Concord. In preparation for the war, the British had the benefit of a large population, professionally trained militia, and economic strength. The colonists, on the other hand, had patriots with a deep commitment to sacrifice for their rights. The Second Continental Congress's most important action was in appointing George Washington as general of the military. After several more arms battles, George III announced the colonist rebellion, and Common Sense by Thomas Paine convinced the Americans to fight for independence as well as freedom. Many leaders, including Thomas Paine, promoted the revolution as an opportunity for self-government by the people, not British authorities. Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence proclaimed its foundation in universal and self-evident human rights. Committed patriots fought against both loyalist Americans and the British. The French and other countries aided the Americans in 1779, making the Revolutionary War a world war. In 1780 to 1781, Americans were losing many battles, but the colonial army in the South held on until Cornwallis stumbled into a French-American trap at Yorktown. Lord North's ministry collapsed in Britain, and American negotiators achieved an extremely generous settlement from the Whigs.